everyone and welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the brand new Vector Flood Fill tool in Affinity Designer version 2.1. I'm going to be using the desktop version of the app. However, it works the same in the iPad version, and while the tools are located slightly differently, you should be able to follow along. This is going to be a bit of a longer tutorial because we have a lot to cover. I'm also going to show you a few ways that you can use the tool, but I've broken everything down into sections so that you can easily jump around if you'd like. So let's get started. First off, what is the Vector Flood Fill tool and where can you find it? So the icon is represented by a paint bucket with nodes pouring out of it, and that's in both the desktop and iPad version. It's going to allow you to fill areas of your design that are harder to fill with the regular fill tool. So you can use it to fill single shapes, but you can also fill overlapping closed shapes and open curves. You can use a variety of different types of fills, such as solid or gradient colors, both opaque and semi-transparent. You can use vector assets saved in the Assets panel, and bitmaps from the Stock Studio, photos, or your external files. So let's head into Designer and take a closer look. I have a bunch of circles here and I want to quickly change them to a mix of colors. Now, of course, I could select each individual circle here in my Layer Studio, go to the color panel or my swatches and pick a color, but the Vector Flood Fill tool makes that a lot easier because I don't actually need to select anything. So I'm going to select the tool first. It's really important you do that because it always remembers the last fill you used. So select the tool first and then load it with whatever fill you want to add. So I'll just choose this yellow and I can start clicking around, and without having to select anything, I can go around and change the colors to whatever I want them to very quickly. And you'll see that it's replaced the colors here in my Layer Studio. Another way that I can do this is to select all of my shapes either with the Move tool or select them in my Layer Studio. I can select the Flood Fill tool, click and start dragging around, and it's automatically going to change it as long as I keep my mouse clicked down or the pencil on the iPad if I'm using that version. Up to now, I've been working with shapes that aren't overlapping, but it works a bit differently where they do. So I have two ellipses, one overlapping the other. Now, if I don't select them first and use the Flood Fill tool, it's going to work exactly the way it did previously. If I select a color and click, it's going to change the color here in the layer stack. And there's still two individual ellipses. However, once I select those, you can distinctly see the overlap. And when you have the Flood Fill tool selected, it's going to light up the various sections that you can fill. So if you use the Shape Builder tool, it works very similarly. As soon as you have the entire thing selected, it's going to show you exactly where your individual segments are. So now if I select a color, if I click, it's going to go up to the bounds of that first part of the overlap. I'll select another color and I'll click, and the same thing's going to happen on this side. And then finally, I can also fill this middle section and it's going to create a sort of petal shape where the two overlap. If you look at my Layer Studio, the two original ellipses remain, but I also have three new individual curves that are made up of the three that I just created with the Flood Fill tool. So these can be moved around. I can use my Move tool and move them. I can go and use my Node tool and make adjustments to them. They are actual curves that I can then go ahead and edit. We're going to come back to this example in a bit and talk about another setting that you can use to change how it works. But for now, let's take a look at using gradients as fills. In addition to filling with solids, you can also fill with gradients of color and use the regular fill tool to adjust them if they don't look exactly the way you want. So just like with the solids, I'm going to select my Vector Flood Fill tool first, and I can select a gradient up here in my panel. So I'll click, and you can see that the gradient is going to be added to my circles. Now, if I select my regular fill tool, and select a shape, you'll see the gradient is represented here. So I can drag this around. I can change the distance between the various colors. I can actually change the color simply by going to my Color Studio or to my swatches and picking a new color. I can also change the opacity of that color if I'd like. Whether you're using solids or gradients, you can use them at any opacity and with or without noise, simply by using the sliders in the Color Studio. So I'll select the Vector Flood Fill tool first, then choose this mustard color, and I'm going to drag the noise all the way up. I'm going to keep the opacity the same, and if I click, you can see that that's filled it with not only the solid color, but the noise as well. With the Vector Flood Fill tool, you can also fill shapes with bitmaps. Whether you're adding a texture, a photo, or a pattern, you can pull it in either by clicking up at the top in the contextual menu, using your assets, or choosing something from the stock studio. And we're going to take a look at all three options starting here in the assets panel. So if I select my Vector Flood Fill tool and then click on one of my assets, I can fill my shape with that particular bitmap. Now, I do want to note that when you pull something in as a vector from the assets panel, it's going to convert it to a bitmap fill, which means it's now rasterized. So keep that in mind whenever you're using assets. Now, because this is a fill, I can grab my regular fill tool and it's going to give me the handles, and I can size this down. I can rotate it. I can do anything I normally would with a fill with the regular fill tool. And I can go back to my Vector Flood Fill tool, pick another asset, and I can keep filling my shapes. This tool actually provides a really quick way to check patterns as you're creating them in Designer. So I have a pattern here that I've created, and I've taken my tile and I've saved it as an asset. I've added another artboard here, and all I need to do is select my Vector Flood Fill tool, click on that pattern, and I can pop that into this other artboard. Now, because this is a fill, I can grab my regular fill tool and I can size this up and down. I can move it around and I can check for anything that might need to be corrected. In addition to the assets panel, you can also pull bitmaps directly from the stock studio. And this is probably one of my favorite aspects of this tool. So again, I'll select my Vector Flood Fill tool. All I need to do is click on the image I want to use. In this case, I just typed texture into the prompt, and you can add it to your shapes. So again, I can grab my regular fill tool and I can size this up and down. I can move it around, but I can keep selecting my Vector Flood Fill tool and picking different images and pull them into my design. And finally, let's take a look at Set Bitmap Fill. So once you select the Vector Flood Fill tool, click on Set Bitmap Fill and go ahead and find a texture either in your photos or in your files. So I'm going to click this glass texture that I pulled from Texture Labs. I've linked it below in the description, and I can start clicking and adding this to my shapes, and you can see it's filling it in here in my layer studio. And I can keep clicking this and picking different ones and filling them in. And again, because this is a fill, I can use my regular fill tool and I can adjust however I need to. One note on using any fills, whether they're solid, gradient, or bitmap, if they're 100% opaque, in other words, no transparency, they're automatically going to knock out whatever fill is already in place. So I have this circle here and it has that texture fill that I just added to it. And if you look at my appearance panel, you can see there's a single fill. If I grab my Vector Flood Fill tool, and in this case I have it loaded with an image from the stock studio, when I click on it, it's going to fill it completely and knock that other fill out. However, if I were to pull something semi-transparent in, it's actually going to stack it depending on what options I choose. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. Before we do that, let's head up to the contextual menu at the top and take a look at fit mode and the 4 options underneath it, starting with none. This means that no scaling is going to be performed on the bitmap fill that you're using to get it to fit into the object. So I still have this one selected, and if I click, you can see that it's not scaled down the way this one is. I can go to my regular fill tool and I can use this handle to size it down if I want, or I could simply choose a different option. So I'll go back to my Vector Flood Fill tool, and this time I'm going to choose Max Fit. This means it's going to scale it so that it fills the entire area without any sort of distortion. Now, one thing, it could mean some cropping in some cases, but for the most part, I don't find that to be an issue. Now, if I click, you can see that it sized it down and it looks a lot more like this one. So I'll go back to my Vector Flood Fill tool and this time choose Minimum Fit. So this is going to be scaled completely so that the bitmap I'm using fits entirely within the shape. So now if I click, you can see that that image is fitting in here. The problem is I get these seams because it's an image, it's not a seamless pattern. And then finally, stretch is going to stretch and scale the bitmap so that it fills the entire area. Now this means there could be some distortion, and I find that especially so when dealing with textures that have shapes like circles in them. If I click, you can see that it looks very similar to this one, but it has stretched it out a little bit. If you're working with a semi-transparent gradient or a bitmap with an alpha background, in other words, no background, you have the option of stacking it on top of an existing fill, as I mentioned earlier. So if I head back up to the contextual menu for the Vector Flood Fill tool, you'll see Fill Mode. The very first one is Add on Top. So let me go to my Appearance panel so that you can see what I'm working with here. So I have this single fill, it's the gray fill here. And if I choose my Vector Flood Fill tool and choose this semi-transparent image that I created with a Texture Labs texture, if I click inside here, you're going to see that it added that on top. And the reason for that is it was partially transparent, not fully opaque. Had it been, it would have knocked this fill out entirely. And I can keep adding that on top with this particular selection chosen as many times as I want. Now, in this case, there's not really a point because at that point, I may as well have used the fully opaque option. I'm going to delete these, and this time I'm going to choose Smart Refill. Now this time I can use that same bitmap fill. I can click it, and again, it's stacked it on top, but I can only add it one time. So right now I'm clicking and you can see that it's not adding anything. So each semi-transparent bitmap or gradient can be added one time using Smart Refill. Now I can go and grab another one. So I could select this gradient here and I could turn the opacity down and I can add that on top. But again, I can only add it one time. The final option is Knockout. And I am going to admit that I find this doesn't always work the way that it's supposed to. This option is supposed to knock out whatever's beneath it, regardless of whether you're working with an opaque or a semi-transparent gradient or bitmap, but sometimes it doesn't work that way. So we'll see if it does this time. I'm going to grab that same semi-transparent gradient and I'll go back to my appearance panel. I have knockout selected and I'll click, and that time it worked. But again, sometimes I find it to be a little buggy and maybe they're working on that. But if you need to, again, you can always knock it out completely with a solid or fully opaque gradient. Now, one thing I want to note, the opacity of bitmap fills cannot be changed. So I have some bitmap fills here in my color palette. I'm going to select this one. And if I go to color, you can see that the opacity is 100% and I can't change that. In Designer, you cannot change the opacity of the bitmap fill. You'd need to do that outside of Designer and save that somewhere. So for example, that semi-transparent glass bitmap that I used, this one, I simply pulled it in, reduced the opacity to 50%, and then saved it. Earlier with the overlapping circles exercise, we touched on how the Vector Flood Fill tool can be used to create custom shapes wherever your shapes overlap one another. Well, the same thing goes for strokes, not just fills. So let's take a look at the basics of that. I have a bunch of overlapping rectangles created with single strokes, and I have them all selected in my layer stack. With my Vector Flood Fill tool selected, if I hover over the overlaps, you can see that just like with that previous exercise, wherever something overlaps, it's going to light up, which means I can create a curve there. So I'll select a color and click, and in my layer stack, you can see that I'm getting this custom shape. And I can just keep clicking around wherever I have overlaps and add my color. Now I can use this to add solid fills, gradients, and bitmap textures. And no matter what I'm using, I'm still going to end up with an individual curve for each shape created. So I'm going to select this paper texture that I have, and I'll click, and you can see that I'm getting an individual curve layer with that bitmap texture. So I'm going to continue to fill this in with my solids and my textures until the entire thing is filled in. When I'm done, if I turn off all of my stroke layers, I'm left with this new shape formed from the various fills that I used. And because each of them is their own curve layer, I can use my move tool and I can individually select them, or again, I can use my node tool and make changes to them. Additionally, because they're each on their own layer, if I want, I can add effects to them individually. So I could take this layer, for example, go to the FX Studio, and I can add a bevel and emboss if I'd like, just to that shape. Now I've deleted all of those fills and I've turned these strokes back on. And this time I've turned on a curve that I created by filling in the entire shape with one single color. So this is a background layer. With these selected, if I choose a color here and I start clicking on shapes that are next to each other and using the same fill, what you'll notice is that I get one single curve even though they were 3 individual clicks, and that's because this background layer is on. If I were to turn that off and do the same thing, you're going to see I get 2 individual curves. Let's take a look at another example. I have a series of 4 donut shapes here and a background curve created by filling in all of the overlaps between these donut shapes. If I select my vector flood fill tool and choose a color, I can create a single donut shape by filling the overlaps here, and you'll see that here in my layer studio. So I'll just keep doing that until I have the 4 distinct shapes. All right, let's turn those off and we'll turn the other layer off and start just with the donuts. So now if I select a color, the very first one that I create is going to be an individual shape. However, from this point out, anywhere that fill that I just created overlaps, I'm going to get a break in the curve I'm creating. So I'll grab this color and you'll see I'm getting 2 different layers. I'm getting the partial circle with an area of it cut out, and I'm getting this area right here, which is overlapped by my yellow donut. So I'll grab this blue, and the same thing is going to happen. This section right here is going to be separate, and I'll get one that looks like this, but in blue. So if I hover over and select, it doesn't give me one shape. It's giving me this as a separate shape from this. And I'll do this final one and the same thing happens. So let's delete these, and I'm going to turn off the strokes and we're going to turn these 4 donut shapes back on because I want to show you another option here called fill to visible boundaries. If I select my 4 donut shapes and I have fill to visible boundaries off, you can see that I have the overlaps showing just like I normally would. So I can choose colors and I can click and I can create different shapes within those overlaps. Let me back up. If I turn that on, watch what happens right here. You're going to see that overlap disappear. And that's because this particular shape is on the very top of the stack. So what that means is I can fill this entire donut and it's not going to take into account any overlaps because with the same fill tool, it's going to go to the furthest visible boundary. And in this case, because it's sitting on the top of the stack, this is the furthest boundary. Now, if I grab another color and click on this blue one, it's going to stop here because that fill is overlapping it. This is the furthest visible boundary with this fill. So I have to click that to add another one. And it's going to be the same way all the way across. Ultimately, how fill to visible boundaries works depends on where your layers are in the layer stack. So whatever you have on the very top is probably going to be filled entirely, and anything underneath of that is going to be partially filled and broken up. All right, so let's apply everything that we've learned to an actual illustration. I'm going to create a stained glass flower illustration like the cover photo from the class. So I have a flower that I've created with overlapping petals using ellipses with single strokes. I'm going to select them all in my layer stack, choose my vector flood fill tool, and I'm going to use my gradients here. So I'm not going to be really careful about how I load these in here. I'm just going to start clicking and dragging and be pretty random about it. And again, because I'm holding my mouse key down, you can see that on the layer stack here, I'm getting single curves wherever I do that. So let's just add this here and there. All right, so I have the entire thing filled in. Now, if I turn off my strokes, you can see I have kind of a weird looking flower shape here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these back on, and I actually want to turn all of these strokes into fills so that I can add texture to them. So with them selected, I'll go up to Layer and Expand Stroke, and I'm going to add them together. So this is going to give me one large curve shape. Again, I can turn this off and on, but I'm going to keep that on because that's going to become the sort of leaded part over the top of the stained glass. Now with this one, I'm going to select all of my shapes, and I'm going to Command G to create a group out of that. I want to use a duplicate of this to create a vector clipping mask. So I'll Command J to duplicate, and I'm going to pull in a stained glass texture. So I have one here from Texture Labs, and I'll link that below. I'll click and open it, and I'm going to place it, release it, and then size it up. And I'm trying to get some light and dark areas around it. So I'm just going to place this very carefully. When I change my blend mode, the light and dark areas are going to give me that look as if there's light behind it. So let me just move this around a little bit. I'm going to rasterize and trim this because anything that's hanging off the canvas is not necessary, and it's just adding to my file size. And then I'm going to use that duplicate, drag it up over the top of the icon so that the texture is clipped within the bounds of that flower shape. And now I can change the blend mode of this to something like overlay, and that gives me that stained glass effect. All right, so that's done, but now I want to add a metal texture and a gradient to the leaded portion of it. So I'm going to go back up to my color palette here, and I think I'll choose something like this one. So it has a little bit of light on the top where there's more light on the overall illustration, and it's darker down here. And again, I'm going to grab a metal texture this time. So again, I have one from Texture Labs, which I've linked below. And I'm just going to click to add it and then drag it into place. I'll rasterize and trim it. And I'm just going to clip it inside of that overall curve. Let me just move this around a little bit. And I think I'll change the blend mode of that texture. That's actually the wrong thing. Let's bring that back to normal. I want to make sure I'm choosing the metal texture, and I'll pick overlay. All right. One final thing that I want to do to this curve is to add a little bit of a shadow to it, because if this was a stained glass piece, then the lead would be raised up a little bit. So I'll go to my FX Studio down here with that layer selected, and I'm going to add an outer shadow. And I can bring the offset up, and I'm going to bring the radius up. And then I'm going to add another one where the offset is all the way down and the radius is down a lot. So it's going to give me a little bit more of an intense shadow right at the very edge. And that's it. I created a stained glass type illustration without having to click into individual shapes to add the various colors, because the flood fill tool allowed me to do this entire illustration in less than 5 minutes. And I can adjust this however I need to, because everything that I did here with the textures and the gradients are all non-destructive. But I'm going to call this one done, and let's take a look at one final exercise where we use this vector flood fill tool with text. I have 2 lines of text here with several single stroke ellipses scattered across the top of them. I'm going to follow the same process that I have in previous exercises, this time taking a bit more care about where I add my solids, gradients, and bitmaps across my letters. So I'm going to do that as a time lapse, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I have filled in my various letters with a mix of gradients and some paper texture here. And I like how this looks, but remember, I can actually take this a step further if I want, and I can stack some textures on top of it as well. So I'm going to go back to my assets here, and I have these dots that I've created as well as some scallops. And if I select the various shapes and the flood fill tool, let's just choose maybe this guy here, and I'll select my dots. Because this is transparent, I can add that right on top of that stack, and I can just create an additional layer of texture on top. So I'm going to choose, let's add here, and I'm just flipping back and forth between the vector flood fill tool and the regular flood fill tool, and just doing this at various sizes. So let me choose the scallops here. Just make sure that you change back to the vector flood fill tool before you pick your next shape. So let's go ahead and choose that, and maybe fill that in here as well. So I'm not going to go crazy with this. I just want to add a little bit here and there, maybe right there. All right. And let's see, I can also use the set bitmap fill part here and pull in some grungy halftone texture that I have. And I'll add that there. And again, I went ahead and used max fit. Let me just pull that up. And I'm flipping back and forth again between the regular fill tool and the vector flood fill tool. So I'm going to call that down. I think that's good. But you can basically create an entire shape just by using the various fills. I could then take this if I wanted to and add some additional texture to it. So I could do what I did with the stained glass and group all of my letters together and create a duplicate out of it, and maybe add, let's see, we'll add another paper texture over top. So I have this paper texture from Texture Labs, and I'll place that as a unifying texture across the entire thing. And I'll just create a vector clipping mask out of that duplicate. And now I have a fun illustration using text and the vector flood fill tool to create some unique designs here. So that's it. That's the vector flood fill tool. It's pretty cool, right? Can you see yourself using it in your own work? Let me know in the comments below, or let me know if you have any questions about how it works. If you enjoyed my teaching style, check out my full-length classes either on Skillshare or my own class site, The Creator Collage, which I've linked both below. And if you want to learn more about Affinity Designer, consider checking out one of these two tutorials next. Thanks for watching.